One thing that I find extraordinary is the enduring resilience of Anne of Green Gables, how this story that is more than 100 years old has never really left us. This year was a milestone year for Lucy Maud Montgomery. Today on the podcast, the enduring legacy of a central figure to Canadian literature. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. Look, so this year marks the 150th birthday of one of Canada's most celebrated authors, Lucy Maud Montgomery. You know the name, and you know the work, and I'm betting you know that she was born and raised on Prince Edward Island too. Maud published 20 novels, more than 500 short stories and poems. She had a career that spanned decades, but by far, her most famous work is the novel that started all of it, Anne of Green Gables. That is a name that makes people smile and delight. That is a story that has persisted. The story of Anne Shirley, the orphan who gets adopted by the siblings, Matthew and Marilla. They live in a fictional town. You know the town. It is called Avonlea on Prince Edward Island. And to me, what's remarkable is that Anne of Green Gables, first published in 1908, it has never really been absent. Anne of Green Gables has been adapted into graphic novels and anime and movies and TV shows, then spin-offs of those TV shows and musicals and a lot more. To celebrate Lucy Maud Montgomery's legacy and the many, many lives of Anne Shirley, I've gathered Laura Robinson, Kat Sandler, and Kathryn Borel here, three fans of Maud's work. Laura, Kat, Kathryn, welcome to the show, y'all. How's it going?
Hello.
Hello. I'm excited that you're all here. Okay, Laura, I'm going to start with you, pal, because you are the chair of the Ella Montgomery Institute. I think a lot of people know the name, but maybe they don't know a lot about who she was. They don't know a lot about Maud. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about Maud and why she was so significant?
Well, of course, she was so significant because of all the writing she did. She created a legacy of writing about girls and women, which has been amazing. And I think that's why she's had such an intense readership, particularly amongst girls and women, but not exclusively so. She is a PEIer, although she left Prince Edward Island when she married her minister husband and spent the rest of her life in Ontario. But in addition to her novels and all the short stories and poetry, she also has left us 10 volumes of handwritten journals and scrapbooks and photographs. So she's really documented a time period in Canadian history that I think is really quite remarkable.
Can you just talk a little bit about, was Maud anything like Anne, would you say?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think in some ways she was. She was a highly sensitive child in the same way that Anne was. She lost her mother when she was 21 months old and was raised by very strict Scottish Presbyterian grandparents. And so she had that kind of constraint around her. But I think the big difference is that Anne was an orphan. She had no family. She came to Avonlea fresh and had to kind of learn social propriety. Montgomery was always aware of social propriety.
I want to talk a little bit about the ways that we are often driven to spend time with Maud's writing, Kat, because I think that's a significant part of this. You are currently adapting Anne of Green Gables. You've written a play for next year's season of Stratford about as an adaptation. Do you want to talk a little bit about rereading the novel? What is it that you admire about the writing?
I think it's because I first came to it when I was really little, and I watched that very first Kevin Sullivan OG miniseries that everyone knows and loves so deeply. And then I actually moved to cassette tapes because I was so little. I probably couldn't even read. And so what I've loved about it from the beginning is how funny it is, how amazing Maud's dialogue is, and how accessible and universal the world that she creates for readers of any age and honestly any place. I think it's been translated into 36 languages, and it's been in print since it was in print. So it's definitely something that I think people find a really easy way to connect with. And when you're young, you identify with Anne and her friends. And as I get older, I'm still a little bit older than Anne now. As you get older, you start to be like, oh, wait a second. These are fully fleshed out women in this world. All of the characters in Avonlea are so wholly realized, and their perspectives and journeys are so beautiful. And you can find something in all of them as you age. She's just so good at building a world, not just in the scope of all of the books she wrote, but even in that very first book, that spans 5 years, and we really get to grow up with Anne, and you feel her at every age that she is. So, but I think for me, it always does come back to the comedy. Like re-listening to the audiobook on Audible for this project, I still laugh out loud. Like that dialogue is so good, and it comes from everything, from situation, from characters, from just like a great sardonic deadpan line that Marilla delivers, and you can really hear her saying that. So I love it.
I love that description of like the relationship to the original work and the way that you sort of like keep returning to it, and like, it still sort of has that freshness to it. Kathryn, you were a writer on Anne with an E, which is that CBC Netflix series, the one that people will not stop writing us, being like, bring it back for 8 more seasons, never stop this show. But
I am an Argentinian teenager, and you have robbed me of my show. And why did you do that, Kathryn Borel? And I'm like, I swear it wasn't my decision.
You're not. Kathryn Borel is not personally responsible for Anne with an E not being.
I would have made it for 8 more seasons, I swear.
Okay, there you have it. That is actually an important piece of information to know. But Kathryn, do you want to talk about returning and rereading the original work? What is your relationship to it?
I had a very similar reaction to what Kat was saying. You know, Anne is one of those characters that I go back to every few years, and I find new things that I love about her. Like, I think that all iconic, great characters are sort of prismatic. Like, depending on how the light is shining through them at different times in your life, they end up sort of revealing different things about yourself and the world. And in a world that is so full of rich female characters, it's like you've got your young female character, you've got female friendships, you've got perimenopausal characters, you have menopausal characters. Like they're sort of at every stage of sort of female experience. It's like in the mind and in the body, you have a character that is in these books for you. But really, like, my knee-jerk response is I've got to go back to when I first read the Anne of Green Gables books. I was really young. I must have been 7 or 8 and was given to them. I was given all of the books of the braided girls of yore. So I had Pippi Longstocking, Anne Shirley, and Laura Ingalls Wilder, the little freaks who didn't really belong anywhere. I wonder why my parents gave them to me. I have this very clear memory reading, like in my early readings of the books, because I read them so many times. But this really clear memory of catharsis. Like, I was so relieved that I was finally interacting with a young female character who got mad, and expressed anger, and then faced consequences, the consequences of her anger for sure, but then was also forgiven for it. And was not instilled with a sense of great shame because she had gotten angry. And I got mad a lot as a kid, and I had this very overdeveloped sense of justice. And I don't remember the people around me being very receptive to that. And so for me, Anne ended up being this very safe harbor for me as a kid, this sort of template for alternate, like non-polite, non-pretty ways of expression. And that was such a huge relief and made me feel a lot less alienated as a child. So yes, she was very important to me.
Yeah, the way that you're describing that set of emotions there, particularly that idea of like I had an overdeveloped sense of justice as a child, is a very specific sentence. I'm like, I can imagine you as a child, Kathryn, but also I can imagine like the way that like adults tend to make less room for that from children, and then you get a character like Anne, Laura, who sort of allows safe space for all those emotions to kind of come out. It feels like when people have a relationship with Anne, they don't really have just a relationship with what the character's going through, but like the way of being in the world, if you will. And I'm just curious, like, what you make of like what Maud was trying to say through Anne by giving her all these complicated emotions and then letting them have that space in a time, we should say, in 1908, where maybe that would have been not so acceptable and would have been actually quite foreign to maybe read in a novel.
Oh, absolutely. I think Montgomery was up to so much with Anne. I mean, what we see is an outsider coming into Avonlea, this place of such propriety and ways of behaving badly, not meaning to. I mean, that's the interesting piece, as Kathryn's saying. She wants to fit in, but she does things like put flowers in her hat going to church, which everyone's shocked and appalled by. Yeah. And so she's constantly reprimanded. But what I think is amazing is that she finds acceptance because of her difference and not, despite her differences. And I think that's the piece that Montgomery, that's really special, because what we're learning there is about this child's empowerment. She does not have to change to fit into Avonlea. And in fact, what we see is Avonlea changing. Matthew comes out of his shell in order to get a puff sleeve dress. Marilla becomes a softer, gentler person. So Avonlea shifts because of this girl child. And I think that is a really remarkable message in that time period. And can we just say, still today, we need that message.
Well, again, that's one of the remarkable things about the stories, like the consistency of the adaptations. They've never really stopped, and they sort of continue to right now. So I want to hear from each of you about your favorite adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. Kat, why don't I start with you?
For me, it goes all the way back to the Kevin Sullivan series, but I'm such a huge fan of Anne with an E. I'm like trying really hard not to fangirl all over Kathryn right now.
Thank you.
Just in our general fangirling world here. And I think it's because that series gave us like one of the first like cinematic fantasy versions of that world. And that cast, that original cast of Megan Follows, Colleen Dewhurst, Richard Farnsworth, and Jonathan Crombie as kind of like the big four, really just embodied, I think, like when I go back now and I read it and I go back and watch that series, I'm like, oh yeah, that feels so right. They feel so right in those roles. And because they were cast so well, you really got to drill down into the emotional heart of some of those scenes on top of the scrapes and the comedy and all the kid stuff within that book. Yeah. But I also feel like I should pay some lip service to the Anne of Green Gables musical, which is like the longest running musical in Canadian history. Yeah. Started in 1965. And I think these two things, they do a really great job of distilling this really long epic story. Like Anne of Green Gables is a true Canadian epic for me. Like it spans so many years and so many worlds. And it does both of those adaptations have to distill it into something that is much shorter. So it's, those are my two favorites.
Kathryn, what about you? What adaptation are you picking?
I have to say Anne with an E, not because I'm legally mandated to. I'm actually legally mandated. No. It is impossible not to say Anne with an E because. And I'll tell you a small anecdote. So I started on the show in season 2 because our incredible showrunner, Moira Wally-Beckett, wrote the entire first season herself. And then during seasons 2 and 3 brought in an all-female writer's room, which was also the first experience of me being just working with only women, which was incredible. But I got to go to set for my episode, which was the 3rd episode of the 2nd season. And just one of our standing sets was in Caledon, and seeing Green Gables for the first time and just sort of like falling to my knees and being like, I wish I could telepathically go back to that lonely child that I was when I was 8 years old and tell her like, hey kid, you're going to be standing in front of actual Green Gables 30 years later. So just like, don't worry about it. Everything's going to work out just fine. Like you're going to be holding a literal chicken, an animal actor chicken, staring at Green Gables, crying.
I mean, I just wanted to say for the folks who are listening to the podcast or radio version of this conversation, both Laura and Kat started tearing up as you were sort of painting the scene of you arriving on set and seeing Avonlea for the first time. Laura, you have no pressure whatsoever to pick Anne with an E.
That's so funny.
No wrong answers, Laura.
Now that I know that there was an animal actor chicken on set, I have to say, though, the Sullivan miniseries is the comfort food of Anne of Green Gables, right? So there's something about that adaptation that has a hold in the minds of Canadians, I think. And I love the new graphic novel, Anne of Green Gables by Mariah Marsden, because it's so beautiful. It actually makes you tear up when you read it. It's very faithful to Anne of Green Gables, and it's just such a lovely text. But I will have to say that once I adjusted to it, Anne with an E, I think, is an important and really engaging adaptation. And I think, I just taught a course in adapting Anne of Green Gables, and a lot of my students chose to write on Anne with an E, which is understandable. But I think it hits so many of the issues that Montgomery taps into, but that are in the zeitgeist right now that we're all concerned with. And so it's not comfortable. like Sullivan's.
Yeah,
We can't, like,
it's not comfort.
relax into it.
Yeah.
But it engages us on a different and really important level, I think.
Okay, I want to come back to that course that you taught about adapting Anne of Green Gables, because I think that's a really important thing to do. But also, now we've had all of this much conversation about Anne with an E, why don't we just hear a clip from it?
People would laugh at me because I use big words, but if you have big ideas, you have to use big words to express them, haven't you? For example, I am enraptured by this glorious landscape.
Kathryn, I got to ask you about the show and the way that it has resonated with international audiences. But I know we joked about it earlier about the idea of like Argentinian fans being like, bring back the show. But that's a real thing. It sort of became this global sensation that connected a lot of people to the story. What do you make of the outcry following the cancellation? What do you think people were responding to there?
I think that the version of Anne that Moira and the rest of us created, and how Anne was brought to life by not only Amy Beth McNulty, the incredible Irish actress who played her, but also all of the amazing key creative talent that we had on that team, like our costume department, set deck, art, like props. It was really like a unified vision for this world that this character, this incredible character lived in. And I think that, but like, if you take the 10,000-foot view of what was sort of robbed, what I personally robbed from people when I made the unilateral decision to cancel Anne with an E, I am kidding, obviously, but no, when it was, that's right. No, but I think that show gave a sense that if you're an outsider, it is possible to find your place in the world. And you don't have to do it by compromising who you are, compromising your big, unresolved, confusing feelings. You don't have to wrap them up in more attractive packaging in order to be loved and accepted and celebrated. And so I think when our Anne went away, I think that world went away too. And it's like, childhood is hard, right? Like when you are a kid, you're trying to make sense of things. And I think childhood is especially hard for little girls who are dealing with feelings and dealing with their perceptions of how they're supposed to be operating in the world. And Anne was a place where like all of that stuff could happen with guardrails on, but without compromising like liberty and freedom and imagination. And so to me, like the outcry makes sense. It's grief, right? It is sadness for that world going away, and for the possibility of that world going away. And the outcry is still happening. Like I still get DMs on Instagram from teen girls, wondering where Anne went and when she'll come back, and it's just like, I always think about whenever a series ends, you leave these characters in these unresolved spaces, right? It's like in season 3, like we left Caquette out there. And I'm like, sometimes I think about Caquette and I'm like, she's still out there somewhere. Is she okay? And it's kind of heartbreaking. So it makes sense that people are as heartbroken as I sometimes am at 2 a.m. when I wake up and wonder where those characters are right now.
If folks are just joining us, my name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud, and this is Commotion. We are celebrating the 150th birthday of Lucy Maud Montgomery with a close look at her most famous work, Anne of Green Gables. Laura Robinson is here. Kathryn Borel is here. Kat Sandler is here. Kat, as I mentioned earlier, you're currently developing this new play adaptation of Anne of Green Gables. In your read, like, what does a good Anne of Green Gables adaptation have to still sort of feel true to the story? What's your read on that?
That is a great question. And I think, as both Laura and Kathryn know, the rough thing of it all is you're just never going to make everyone happy. Everyone identifies with something else magical within that story. But for me, when I was going through and watching Anne with an E and watching the miniseries and reading the graphic novels, I was like, okay, I think there are hallmarks here that young me and old me would be really upset if they weren't included. So there are certain plot points. I'm like, you need a carriage ride. You need Anne at a train station. There's certain plot points that I would be very upset to not see. And then people will, I know I'm going to get letters about not including the brooch, because we just don't have time in a play. I know we don't. People are so intense about the brooch. I know. I'm sorry. I want to. There's no space. But I think it's also this feeling of wanting to build Anne, the character, in a way that is true to the book, because it all centers around Anne, and she's such a beautiful, identifiable heroine for any age. So the adaptation really needs to show us how and why Avonlea and all these naysayers fall in love with Anne, that she's smart, she's passionate, she's kind, she's learning from her mistakes, and she's growing up. And as she's doing that, so are the people around her. And she's doing all of this with imagination. So I think without that sense of imagination and play and learning, it wouldn't be a true adaptation. But it's also that I think you can't shy away from the darkness in the book. And that's something that I thought Anne with an E did so well, because a lot of horrible things happen even in just the first book, even in Anne's past. And I think it's really important not to just gloss over those, because that's starting from nothing is what makes her journey and her sense of community and belonging that she gains in Avonlea so important. And I think in finding a way to kind of introduce it to younger people, because we're all kind of an age-ish range. And I think we're really familiar with it, but young kids, like, I don't think it's being taught in the same way that it was when we were growing up. And they don't have, like, because Anne with an E is gone, they don't have a way to look at it. It's a lot harder to access the miniseries these days. Gazebo TV for anyone who needs it. But I think it's finding the places that you can update the story, which is at its heart pretty timeless, without kind of crushing that sense of nostalgia that people are really associate with their view of the book.
Laura, I want to maybe end here in that it's been a big year in the Montgomery-verse, if you will, right? Like, you have the sort of 150th birthday celebrations, you have the commemorative coin, but also the original Anne of Green Gables manuscript has been added to the United Nations Register that highlights Canadian heritage. That's a pretty significant deal, and there's something about survivability in all of this, but the idea of a story that keeps surviving, keeps sort of being adapted, and as you said, you teach a course on adapting this work. And as you sort of think about this idea of adapting Anne of Green Gables, how far do people take Anne's story in order to bring it to the modern times? Like, what are the questions that people ask that make the story not just like, here's an old story made relevant again, but actually here's a story that's always been relevant the whole way through? What are those questions that you think guide the work of adaptation?
Oh, that's such a good question. So many answers are coming into my head. People have done such different things. So there's 3 graphic novels that recently came out. One I just mentioned, but one is Anne of West Philly. So Anne is a Black girl growing up in West Philly, a foster child. Anne, an adaptation, sort of. Anne is also a foster child and a lesbian. Sorry, spoiler. So it's just, so they're doing, and very contemporary, very urban. And one of the things that my students and I talked about a lot is that tension between the pastoral, which we see in the Sullivan miniseries, and the realistic, which I think Anne with an E fell on. It played with that tension more, but fell into the realistic piece, which was so discomforting for some of the viewers, right? Like, oh, this isn't the Anne we know. It's not the Sullivan Anne. But what we see with some of those adaptations is that they're taking it into sort of the real. And the one we had probably the most fun with was Acorn Presses. It's a Charlottetown publishing company. Just did the anthology, which is 10 short stories or poems, young adult fiction, and it's taking Anne to the next realm. So vampires, ghosts, sex trafficking.
Whoa.
A drag, right? A drag queen. So Matthew / Marilla, a drag queen. Anne is a 16-year-old boy who's overweight and gay, seeking his father, who wants really nothing to do with him. It is.
Kathryn's like, I'm going to write that into the next season of Anne.
How much for the rights?
There's a dystopia in there. And so, I mean, it's just, the task was for these young adult writers to really rethink Anne in a different setting. So the students and I kept talking about what are they drawing out from the Anne story? What's keeping it Anne? And sometimes it was Gilbert, not always. So the tension. But I just think it's so wide open, which is what's really exciting, I think, about Anne. She lends herself to everything.
I think that's a beautiful place to leave it. I appreciate all of you being here. This has been wonderful and a delight. Kathryn, I can't believe you made us cry. Kathryn and Laura and Kat, you guys are a delight. Thank you so much for your time again.
Thank you so much.
So wonderful.
Of course. Laura Robinson is a chair of the Ella Montgomery Institute Management Committee at the University of Prince Edward Island and professor of English at Acadia University. Kat Sandler is a playwright, director, and screenwriter. You can catch her new non-musical adaptation of Anne of Green Gables at the Stratford Festival next year. That is starting in April. And Kathryn Borel is a television writer. You can watch all 3 seasons of Anne with an E right now on CBC Gem. This is the year that marks Lucy Maud Montgomery's 150th birthday. That is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll see you then.